Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for those of you on the West Coast. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Avoiding the Pitfalls of the Capital Planning Process to Meet Strategic and Budgetary Goals. I'm Sergio Aranda, Product Marketing Manager with eBuilder, and I have the pleasure today of introducing Mr. Curtis Skolnick, Principal Consultant with the KLMK Group. Curtis, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you, Sergio. How are you?
Very well, thank you. We're also joined by Jonathan Entebbe, CEO of eBuilder, who will be moderating today's session. John, how are you?
I'm doing great, thank you, Sergio.
Guys, before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to share some background information on our presenters for the audience, for those of you that are new to eBuilder and the KLMK Group. So let me start with Curtis. Curtis has over 18 years of healthcare strategic and facilities planning experience, and his expertise lies in project launch gap analysis, market modeling, system and new business development, strategic planning, capacity analysis, master facilities planning, CON preparation, functional and space programming, and government and regulatory affairs planning. Curtis has a Bachelor of Science in Healthcare Management and a Master's degree in Administration from the Virginia Commonwealth University, Medical College of Virginia. John is co-founder and CEO of eBuilder, pioneers in capital program and project management software, serving North America's leading organizations in healthcare, education, both at the K-12 and higher ed levels, government infrastructure, manufacturing, and other industries. John earned his degree in architecture from the University of Florida, and while working as a pre-construction services specialist, John experienced firsthand some of the challenges and frustrations associated with inefficient processes, poor cost management practices, and lack of structured project information management. As part of his master's thesis, John came up with the concept of leveraging the internet as a way to improve communications, collaboration, and strategically leverage project data. So 15 years later, here we are. So John, let me turn it over to you.
Okay, great. And before I introduce Curtis, Sergio, I understand that you're working on a white paper that's going to be distributed to everyone who registered after the webinar. Is that correct?
Correct, John, yes. Everyone will receive a copy with that, along with a copy of a link to the recording of the presentation.
Okay, good. And I might mention that again towards the end as well. Well, I'm happy to present Curtis today. KLMK, as many of you may know, focuses with owners in the healthcare industry. And while we do have quite a bit of healthcare individuals on the phone today, if you're an owner that's not in healthcare, this is going to apply to you as well. In our experience, from a systems perspective, we have found that the best success always comes when everyone is aligned with the scope before the execution phase. And Curtis is going to talk about that, that you have to have clearly the proper planning. And they have some neat things that they've done. You'll hear the words launch gap analysis in some of his slides as he goes through it. So, Curtis, I know you have a lot of information to cover. So I'm going to turn it over to you and remind everybody, as you've all, we see a lot of repeat individuals coming, which is great. Please go ahead and send questions using the chat feature within the GoToMeeting toolbar on the right of your screen. And I'll be looking for some pauses between slides, and where appropriate, I'll share those questions back with Curtis. So without further ado, Curtis, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, John, and thank you, Sergio, for that introduction. I really appreciate that. It's very humbling to hear all that. And good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the country. And just want to start it off and say I'm really honored to be leading this webinar on behalf of eBuilder, and I want to thank the folks at eBuilder for allowing us this opportunity. And certainly, while this is a healthcare focus, there is a lot of applicability in other industries on a lot of these topics as well. So keep that in mind. And the last couple of years really in healthcare planning and design, as well as non-healthcare planning and construction in the construction industries, have certainly been interesting, to say the least. And I hope you enjoy the topic today. We're going to talk a lot about launch gap analysis. And I'm sure Taming the Complexities of Capital Planning Process is a great title. It's very complex, but with a few simple tools, I think it's something that early on you can simplify. So what are we going to cover today? And before we really dig into it, we'll get into a little bit of what's going on in today's healthcare environment and the environment at large. And we'll discuss project launch and what that all means. And then we'll dive into the main portion. What is this process we call launch gap analysis, or LGA? And we'll finish up with some Q&A. And John, I understand there may be a few questions and answers we might have in the middle of the presentation. So folks, John will be moderating that piece of it. And if there's a question that comes in, John will certainly make sure we get to those.
Great.
So objectively, we want to understand, it's right there on the slide in front of everyone, how assessing launch readiness positively impacts capital projects. And as John mentioned, really address the importance of aligning project expectations and making sure that everyone understands and what the project elements are, and make sure those elements are fully defined and addressed prior to launch. And we'll use healthcare as a context, but I believe this can be applied to any industry. There's a slide we threw in there. I think you don't need to give this any more attention. Sergio did a nice job of introducing me. Suffice it to say, I have been involved in healthcare strategic and facilities planning and project launch for 18, 19 years, and that's all I've ever done in my career. So I've seen a lot of things, learned a lot of lessons. And with that, let's just start with an overview of what's happening in the industry today. And as you see on this slide, especially as it relates to healthcare, it's scary out there. And like the character here in Edward Munch's painting The Scream, this is what people feel like out there. This is what our clients feel like. This is what industry leaders feel like a lot of times when they're looking down the barrel of a large capital project, and trying to put it in the context of everything that's swimming around them. And people are getting emails and webinar invites every day about things that are on this list, whether it be LEED or evidence-based design or lean processes, or over there on the left, the Affordable Care Act, which we all know as reform. There's a lot of uncertainty, and the only true constant, as we know in healthcare, is change. And as folks in the lean industry will say, we'll use standard of practice. What's the best practice? Then we'll try to break it, and we'll try to make it better. So the only constant really is change, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And what's happened. This is really a precursor to what's happened in the capital markets these last few years. The clouds are beginning to part. I was talking to someone a few months back in a similar discussion, and the mantra was weathering the storm, but we think the clouds are parting, and it's still resonating loudly and clearly. Hospitals have cut back clearly on spending, and the construction industry as a whole has been hurt by large capital projects being ratcheted back. We've seen some loosening, which is good. We've also still seen a lot of folks retooling their projects. But as hospitals in particular cut back on capital spending, age of plant continues to rise. It's about 10 years nationwide, and that's up about a half a year from only a few years ago. So folks aren't able to reinvest like they should be. One client we're working on has their age of plant of almost 12 years, which is extraordinarily high in our industry. And it's clear that owners need to reinvest. And hospitals, especially in the not-for-profit sector, don't make as much money on the bottom line as other folks in private industry. And one industry standard is that a hospital needs to generate a positive margin of about 4% to keep current with technology. Most not-for-profits are operating on razor-thin margins, 1%, 2%, 3%. The last couple of years, even struggling to make a little bit of a profit. And it's tough to do today. And the development of a strategically and fiscal responsible capital plan is job number one. On the flip side, what we've learned, it's a buyer's market. So if you have the money, if you have the access, if you can find those alternative sources of capital, now's the time to buy. It's a good time. And you got to be smart about it, though. Well, we've been counseling our folks and telling these folks, you got to prioritize your projects. Those of us with kids, certainly here, Dad, can I have this? Mom, can I have that? And those of us in the industry hear the same, and rightly so from those in the organization. As things change, people want the latest and greatest. They want to be able to keep up with the competition. They want the latest and new technologies, because that's not only what the providers are demanding, it's what the consumers are demanding. I want to go to the hospital with the latest and greatest piece of equipment. And in order to stay, current, the hospitals have to spend a few dollars. They've got to keep up with competition, but they should do so based on what's necessary to either further the strategic goals of the organization, generate a positive return on investment, or if there's a critical infrastructure upgrade you need. Define what you need, spend on what you need, while keeping an eye on the future. That's critical. Got to keep an eye on the future. A few years back, folks were able to plan in a lot of flexibility and a lot of additional space to plan for the future. Now, not so much. Got to be a little smarter about it. But while folks are hunkered down or weathering the storm, and you don't want to leave the shelter empty, so you wither and weaken on a daily basis. You got to have your shelter stocked with food and water and materials to ensure that once this storm is over, and hopefully all these clouds are finally parted, you're ready to take the world head on and thrive. So our message has been that if you can't get the bonds or the capital to invest now, but investment is still necessary, it's certainly not going away. You still need to reinvest in your plan. Continue to plan. Don't become paralyzed with fear. Be smart about it. Be efficient. Be creative. Look at the solution from all angles, and if you allow yourself, the organizations you represent, to become paralyzed, you'll be swallowed by the competition. Likely the competition isn't resting, so why should you? And in today's environment, it's more important than ever to ensure that your capital investments are prioritized and well conceived. And so now, in our opinion, is the time to conduct a launch gap analysis or make sure that the things are aligned, as John said earlier, to ensure your project addresses the priorities of the organization and sets up the enterprise to quickly respond once the market conditions improve. And I hope that's piqued a little bit of your interest of what comes to here, what we're getting into next. So what is project launch? What is this thing we call launch gap analysis? Some folks have probably heard of this term launch. It's something that we at KLMK certainly focus on and believe it's one of the most critical things to do you can do in a project is focus on launching it appropriately. We believe it increases the likelihood of success. It aligns expectations first and foremost. And one of the things it does that's really interesting, kind of a byproduct of launch, is if it's done correctly, it creates a collaborative environment, an environment of dynamic tension where the team members' strengths are used with each other and against each other to allow folks to creatively challenge each other in a positive way. And it doesn't become an adversarial environment. And, not executing launch properly, so what are the risks? We believe, and we've seen it results in confusion or delay, increased costs and dissatisfaction. And sometimes those aren't known for a while. You get down the road in design or in construction, you realize, hey, what you really wanted in scope was X, Y, or Z, and it ends up being A, B, or C. So it has to be defined early on, and everybody needs to know what's being built, what's being designed from the very start. And as this slide shows, it's certainly easier to make changes early on. The launch process is geared towards getting organized early and defining the project as accurately as possible. Like I said, it's a lot easier and less costly to make changes before designing construction. I'm sure you folks have seen this type of graphic before, but making changes to design can be costly, and it could impact elements such as scope and equipment. We all know how costly change orders and how dissatisfying those things can be. I try to use the old accent of measuring twice and cutting once. Certainly, measuring twice early on is a lot easier than cutting twice down the road. So the end depends on the beginning. Launch sets the project expectations and tone and further defines and refines the scope and other project parameters. During launch, you're getting yourself ready and your organization ready before you draw the first schematic design, dig the first hole, or set the first footing. And launch gets everyone bought in and heading down the same direction. Launch sets the foundation of which the project is ultimately designed and constructed. So you got to begin with the end in mind. Know where you are, know where you're going before you take off. Start with a plan. Be realistic and plan diligently. Get organized. Get a project implementation plan in place and make sure that everyone understands where they're headed. Be realistic, strategically and financially. Understand timing. Then end with design and construction. And bridge those gaps with what we call launch gap analysis.
So Curtis, we have a question here asking,
sure,
what individuals, companies, or roles are part of the launch gap analysis?
It depends on the timing of the project. If it's early on, certainly it's the folks who've had any input into the process. It's certainly the owner. It could be the architect. If a site has been purchased, it'll be the engineers who have looked at the site, and those folks will be involved in helping collect and creating a catalog of information of all those things that have happened to the project to date. first and foremost, it's the owner's representative, both internally or externally, but internally it's that person who's in charge of the project, if it's a project manager on the project, or whomever might have initial, I guess, authority over the project. And certainly we involve the C-suite as well.
Thank you.
You know, throughout a launch gap analysis, every major issue that might affect launch is identified and explored. It's not just a visioning exercise focused on design and building elements. Instead, the launch gap analysis is much broader, much more encompassing. If you're wavering from the target or unsure where the true target is, where you're headed, launch gap analysis will help you get more focused. It creates a catalog, like I mentioned, of all known project info. And so as project managers or project leaders, you all have the project information on hand and don't need to search high and low for elements of the project. And you know, you've probably heard the saying, you don't know what you don't know. Sure, this seems obvious, but when millions of dollars are on the line, you can't afford not to know. You can't afford not to ask the questions. You got to ask the questions. In today's economic environment, projects, as I mentioned, must be prioritized. And conducting the launch gap analysis will help you ensure that your project addresses the priorities of the organization, assessing what's known, what's currently unknown, what has been contemplated, and what is not of critical importance is a key element of the launch gap analysis. And this involves data and information gathering, key stakeholder interviews, and intense facilitated work sessions where, you know, we say we can get real around this project. And the goal is to identify gaps and expectations versus realities and help develop a roadmap to follow when bridging the gaps and to assess the hospital's level of readiness to get the project off the ground. As I mentioned, we get into data collection, and I view this as much as a physician treating a patient. There are three main elements of the launch, or three main phases of a launch gap analysis. It's just like a physician treating a patient. You've got the discovery phase, which is the history and physical. So that asks what information is currently available. And this involves initial data gathering and pre-session interviews, and especially those folks from the question earlier, folks in the C-suite, folks who've been involved in the project both internally and externally. And then we get to diagnosing the issue, gap analysis. Where are the gaps in what's known and what's unknown? What's been done, what hasn't been done, what needs to be contemplated before you move forward? From there, we develop the treatment plan, and that's the implementation plan. You know, how can we bridge those gaps to ensure everyone's expectations are aligned and we're headed down the same path together?
Curtis, I just want to make a comment here. The first bullet you had of discovery,
Yes.
You don't have to go back to the slide, but that's a common theme and mistake we see a lot in our industry of software vendors selling to owners is they want to go right into solution mode, and really they don't ask the questions or the right questions, and it's a killer, you know, from that perspective. That's my comment. We did have a question come in. Someone said that they're using IPD, Integrated Project Delivery, and they wanted to know if that this works with, you know, this launch gap works with that process. Is it complementary to it? I guess is their question.
Absolutely complementary. That's actually something I talked to a little bit later on. It's very complementary to IPD. And in fact, it's probably, it works best with an IPD, with an integrated type of environment. You know, make sure that all those parties, you know what they're getting themselves into when they, you know, sign a tri-party agreement or get involved in the contractual arrangements of IPD. So I think it's very important that the folks on the IPD team ask themselves these questions before they get involved and before they get too far down the road. Make sure that something like this has been conducted.
Thank you.
You know, the launch gap, you know, helps keep you focused on all the elements that we call the big three: scope, schedule, and budget. Much of the time invested in the launch gap analysis focuses on discovery and gap analysis around these. So scope is a strategy. It's kind of the why and the what. And during the history and physical, or the discovery phase, it's amazing how typically there are many views on scope, but no one really articulates a clear and consistent view. I've had interviews with leadership team, and I've asked folks, you know, what do you think this project is? Just ask it that simply. You know, tell me the scope of the project. I asked 9 people. I get 9 different answers, maybe 10 different answers. It's really very interesting to see how folks think they know what the scope of a project is, and then when you quite simply ask them the question, away from a group setting, how many different answers you're going to get. The schedule is then the when, and how many times have we heard, we want to start construction in 9 months and the land hasn't been zoned, there's no master plan, funding isn't secure, regulatory controls, things like certificate of need in the healthcare world, those things are still blank. So you got to get realistic on the schedule in the early stages and make sure that the owner, the people implementing the project, people that own the project, really understand all those different schedule elements and how complex this animal is. The budget's the how, and it relates directly to the scope. The scope control is something that we believe highly in, of course. Controlling the schedule and budget by monitoring the scope, and if the scope starts to creep either up or down, you got to find out the reasons why before you move forward. Maybe perfectly good reasons, but you certainly don't want to continue moving forward until you answer the question, is this something we should justify? And then you've got to adjust all your models, your budget, your schedule, your financial analyses on return on investment before moving on. These big three are inextricably linked. And, you've got to understand all the elements of the budget. It's not just construction. We've heard folks, it may sound simple, but we've actually had clients where we've walked in and had budgets approved by a board that only included the construction line item. It only included those costs. And then later on, looking at the budget, we forgot equipment, we forgot some soft costs, and they had to go back to the board and ask for additional funds. So, when you look at a budget, may sound simple. You may say, yeah, sure, we've got that under control, but make sure they really know what the owner for sure knows what they're talking about when they make that statement. And as luck would have it, there we go. My computer's locking up. Sorry about that. And we develop an implementation plan to get you there. It gets you organized. And it handles all these steps that are popping on the screen here. But really the key deliverable out of the launch gap analysis process is an understood and agreed upon simple project implementation plan that helps guide the team, organize the team, and is delivered to leadership for approval, and is delivered to the project delivery team for consistent implementation. We think this is the number one thing you can do to make sure your project goals are met. So what is it then that you need to investigate? What are the elements of a launch gap analysis? And I'm going to touch on a variety of these. This is what we call our launch gap analysis wheel. And if you look around this wheel, starting with strategic master facilities plan and getting all the way to transition and occupancy, if you miss a spoke in this wheel, it's not going to roll. So let's talk for a few minutes about each of these. First and foremost, scope must be clearly defined. What strategies and goals is the hospital or the organization trying to achieve? What's the scope of the envisioned project? How is it defined? And clearly articulating the project to everyone involved is paramount prior to getting going. If each team member of the team can't clearly describe the scope of the project, like I mentioned in my example earlier, we'll have problems down the road for sure. The goals of the project established early on should be measurable, and the goals should be touchstones that you come back through during the project and ask yourselves and ask the team members, are we meeting these goals? And if you're not, you're out of alignment.
And Curtis?
Yes.
And maybe you'll get into it with these other slides. Someone's asking here, how is the launch gap analysis different from the functional program as described in the AIA guidelines for healthcare facilities?
Sure. That's a great question, and actually I'll get into that. I will get into that a few slides down the road. But functional and space programming on that wheel is part of what we call process planning or integrated process planning. So space programming is an element, and then space programming should follow strategic master facilities planning. That's the strategic master facilities planning is the jumping off point for space programming. There's a few other elements that work into that, but that's a great question and absolutely is part of the launch gap analysis. It's not different, it's a component of. So I'll get to that here in a second, though. It's a good segue. But first and foremost, there needs to be, again, that clearly defined scope. And capital projects are tactical. They're identified as part of a project. Projects are not a strategy in and of themselves. Strategy is the overall game plan that helps meet mission and vision and some sort of goal, some sort of measurable objective. Tactical element, then, is that capital project. And there are a variety of things you got to do to get that project going, and one of those is a master plan. So all plans must be based on facts, a rigorous analysis of the internal and external market, And this strategy should be based on what's realistic. Don't get emotional when it comes to planning. Stick with the facts. Be objective. What's your market telling you? What's your market analysis telling you? What are your competitors doing? Ensure that along with strategic planning, a clear financial plan is developed. Embark on a capital project with no ROI is not a wise move. Most of our clients ask us or will tell us, this is what I'm focusing on because this is what's making me money. If it's not making me money, I'm not focusing on it. If I don't have a strategic need for it, I'm not focusing on it. So the rationale for moving forward is simple. There must be an urgency and an urgent need, both internally and externally. In one case, we assisted with planning the implementation of a new facility in the Northeast. There was an external competitive and internal infrastructure. There were both, external competitive and internal physical infrastructure reasons for moving forward. And they focused on those elements, the services that addressed their needs, and they didn't build the new cardiac pavilion if the cardiac market is saturated. They focused on a certain market, short-stay surgical hospital, and realized that's the niche that we want to hit. That's the underserved market. So we're going to focus on that. We're not just going to be keeping up with the Joneses here. We're going to lead the Joneses down the road. Next are discussions about guiding design principles. And this starts to get into, as someone mentioned, functional and space programming. But how much do you really know about things like evidence-based design or sustainable concepts like LEED? If you measure the impact these concepts may have on your project, a lot of our clients are interested in implementing LEED or evidence-based design, but really don't know what that means. So we have to help educate, and we use our design team partners as well to help educate our clients on that. What exactly does it mean? How does it impact space? How does it impact scope and flow? How does it impact the budget? The big three. So positive impacts such as potentially lower life cycle cost or decreased length of stay or hospital-borne infections, nosocomial infections as we call them in the industry. Or on the flip side, they could increase building envelope or have higher first costs. So make sure our clients and folks on the phone really counsel their folks that they're working with to understand both the positives and potential negatives of implementing these things to their projects. The delivery of healthcare continues to become more and more outpatient focused. But when building a hospital, the patient room still remains the essential building block of the building. So having deep dive discussions on the design of the patient room will certainly impact design. We're having those with a client right now down in Florida, and those are absolutely impacting the design and the overall scope of our building. It's a main building block. So get into those discussions early. That can certainly help you down the road when you get into space programming and design, and set some guardrails, set some guiding principles, some goals. Folks involved in strategic planning always talk about pillars. And these are some pillars that we developed on a project around service, environment of care, customer needs, employer of choice, who's going to be involved in terms of what constituents do we need to discuss these items with, and there's a very sustainable business model. So from that perspective, you need to look at all these elements on these pages. This is what we try to counsel our clients in making sure they defined measurable goals or measurable objectives around each of these goals and guiding principles. We also want to look at site analysis and land acquisition, another key element of any plan, of any capital plan. Especially if you're looking at a greenfield site, you really need to do your homework on the site. Don't let the land drive the facility design. And while location and purchase price are important, so are elements such as site development costs, the cost to get the site ready to use, usable acreage, capacity of the site for future expansion and development. You want to minimize site development costs so you can maximize dollars going towards the facility development. Have you completed all the necessary due diligence on the site prior to purchase or development? We surveyed the site, pulled titles, completed environmental analyses, looked into zoning regs impacting the site, researched wetlands, researched endangered species, etc. All of these can impact how much you spend and how much time you spend developing a site. So complete a site master plan to understand access issues, disposition of adjoining properties and roadways. Understand all you can about the site, the upsides and the downsides, and the potential costs associated with development prior to development. Next, it's essential that the project delivery team get organized, both internally and externally. Are you internally organized? Are you organized internally well? Does everyone understand their roles? Are there clearly defined meeting steps? Are all the right players internally around the table that need to make these decisions? Are regular committee meetings set up? And are you willing to create this environment I mentioned earlier of dynamic tension, allowing folks to play off of each other and use the strengths? Or is it going to be a very authoritative or dictatorial relationship? You need to understand the leadership dynamics of the organization. Ideally, there are internal and external team members involved who are all ostensibly aligned toward a common goal and outcome. And in reality, the push and pull of competing incentives is all too common. Oftentimes, it results in difficult to manage relationships, misaligned owner and project delivery team priorities, project overruns, dissatisfaction, and an experience that's overall unpleasant for everyone involved. And it really doesn't have to be this way. By aligning incentives, expectations, and outcomes at the outset of a project and encouraging creative discussions, this dynamic tension can be created, and team members can challenge each other equally for the common good. The following are some ways.
We have a question here of, do you get involved in helping the owner contractually set these parameters up to affect some of these outcomes that you're talking about?
Yeah, especially, folks, we had a question earlier about IPD. If it's an IPD environment, that's the best way to do it. But certainly, if folks aren't contractually aligned, we do try to create an atmosphere when we bring the team on or when the team is brought on in an integrated nature and work that into the scope, the contracts, and understanding how we're going to be working together. And I'll get into that here in a minute as well, but making sure that it's not just a handoff process for these things, but make sure that people are integrated, and it's really a transfer of knowledge process. And it's a transition process, not a handoff where people are disassociated. So, within IPD, that's a contractual arrangement we would utilize. But there are ways of doing it without tying people together in a tri-party agreement or something of that nature.
Thank you.
That's a great segue into a contracting approach. What are the different contracting approaches available? And there's several ways to deliver a project. Do you know the pros and cons of the different approaches? What approach is right for you, your project and goals? Some folks might not be ready for IPD, but certainly working together is one way. Is something we, regardless of the contracting mechanism, we obviously support. So what works well for one organization may not work for you based on your organization's vision or your owner's visions, goals, and objectives. You've all seen these. These are the most common approaches, including design, build, construction manager at risk, and all have some benefits and all have some downsides, some bigger than the others. Again, it's you got to do your homework, and I think it's tailored to your different organizations. Of course, we believe that one game-changing approach that we're investing in and we're recommending folks investigate is IPD. And I mentioned, talked about that a little earlier. That's a whole other webinar.
Curtis,
yes.
You have an attendee asking that you made mention to evidence-based design a couple of times. They just asked if you can just give a quick little vignette about what that is.
Sure. Evidence-based design is a movement that's been around for a while that states that the designed environment has a positive impact, or if not designed appropriately, it can have a negative impact, but should have a positive impact on patient outcomes. So there were some landmark studies done a bunch of years ago that looked at elements of noise reduction, looked at views of nature for patients. So one patient was given a view in a patient room of a brick wall outside of their patient room, and one patient was given or a series of patients were given views of nature. And the people who were conducting the study monitored folks' perception of pain and monitored how long it took to get patients out of the hospital. And in both cases, perceptions of pain were rated higher for those folks that had views of the wall, and were rated lower for those folks that had views of nature. And folks got out of the hospital and had generally higher satisfaction when they had, pleasant views or, less noise. So that's generally it. There's a lot that goes into evidence-based design. Again, that's a whole other topic of discussion. That's generally states that, again, based on sound evidence, on research, that the design environment has a positive impact on patient care outcomes.
Okay, and I'll ask one other that really related to the last slide of contracting methods that somebody asked. They're asking, is IPD the best approach? You know, if you had to take your pick, you know, would you pick IPD every time, or would you say that in some cases it's not the best fit and you're going to use other types of approaches?
Yeah, I think that in the latter. We would certainly want to make sure that everyone understands the different delivery approaches, and some folks may be ready for IPD, and some folks might not be. Certainly, the theory we agree with is that regardless of the contracting approach, it should be collaborative. And if it's not a strict IPD, it should be a collaborative approach. We wholeheartedly believe that, but certainly IPD might not be right for an owner. But we want to make sure, again, that everybody's educated on just what are the options out there.
Thanks.
Someone asked you're welcome. Someone asked the question earlier about space programming and what we call integrated process planning, which addresses clinical and operational processes and how form should follow function. You know, building a replacement facility or expanding a hospital, you know, gives you the unique opportunity, and your clients the unique opportunity to function without the constraints, real or not, that an older facility has. And you know, the provision of healthcare services continues to change rapidly. So, you know, have your clients clearly define how clinical care should be delivered in the future, not only in terms of direct patient care processes, but those supportive elements such as supply chain, information flow, how someone gets registered into the hospital. Have you truly considered how the facility form will enable these functions? You know, the picture on the left side of the slide is actually an actual picture from an operational integrated process planning event that was done several years ago at St. Agnes Hospital in Baltimore. That hospital is in the latter stages of construction. This was a value stream mapping session using lean transformation principles, and it was conducted and coordinated with programming and design. Architects were in the room, engineers were in the room, construction folks were in the room. These folks are these people you see in the picture are actual operational people, physicians, nurses, staff, and in this case, function was the focus. And how the built environment enabled that function was an outcome down the road. So really focus on function first. How are things going to flow? How are you going to handle supplies? How are you going to handle patients? And then the form will be defined as an outcome of that. You know, this was I think a very insightful comment from an owner team participant, from a partner, operational design partner we have, and this owner, this nurse said, I just wish I could get my hands on the pieces and move them around, and then I could go through the process in my head and move things to fit it. You know, that was her talking about where she was in her current nurse-patient unit. She had the right flow in her head, and she had the process in her head, but she was unable to move those things around on the paper. That's what integrated process planning does before you start building, before you get deep in design. Start moving those puzzle pieces around on the paper to help you define how they'll support flow appropriately in process. And you know, you got to get the right team. And we use a collaborative model of planning, and there's different elements. It involves internal and experts teams to address process flow, space programming, conceptual schematic design, and initial master project budget. It reduces the time and handoffs, and it's a way to define and control scope, and allows you to begin controlling scope by comparing the space program to the master plan, the strategic plan, and the scope developed. This, we believe, an integrated process planning approach results in better scope definition, better project cost definition, an environment of dynamic tension that I mentioned earlier, a program that we hope has been test fit, a base for detailed operations improvement, and a transition to design rather than a handoff from space programming planning to design. What we see a lot of times is there's a handoff, and the architect or the design team may ask questions or may rehash items that were answered or asked in previous meetings. If you get the architect or the design team in early and helping define that, along with a process planner, along with a programmer, and being able to do it around certain scope items, then we believe the architect can design a building that's truly designed with functional intent in mind. And that architect will also be able to tell you during that integrated process planning if they truly can design to the certain metrics that are being discussed in these meetings, in these process meetings. Transitioning from that concept, start to move from planning into some of the implementation elements of launch. First up is schedule. What are your schedule goals and deadlines? Are they hard or soft deadlines? Have you developed an overall master program schedule, including all the elements, design, regulatory approvals, and so on? It's not just construction. Is your schedule realistic? How do you know? Owners are very eager to get into new facilities with or without expert input, either from internal or external sources. Target dates need to be, we think, they all typically need a dose of reality if they haven't had some outside input. So you got to keep in mind all the regulatory approvals. We think that's a big thing that impacts these projects at the front end. Among other regulatory hurdles, certain states differ on this. Zoning, CON are the two most common processes that most projects will need to address early on that impact schedule. If they're not addressed properly, they'll definitely impact your schedule, could impact your scope and your budget if not addressed proactively. You want to work within the regulations, but don't let the zoning submittal or the CON applications dictate the scope. And don't submit those until the scope and schedule are clearly defined. Again, you want the project to define these submittals and not the other way around. We've seen that happen where folks have maybe submitted a CON application early without asking all these questions and then realized, it's a little bigger, a little different than we thought. Now we've got to go in for a modification. The same holds true for the master program budget. A few years ago, planning standards may have been $1 million per bed. I wouldn't assume that these days. Folks, always remember that first number you present, so make sure you do your homework and include everything. As I mentioned earlier, not just construction. Make sure the owner understands what is included in the entire budget. It sounds basic, but once you've established a budget, have a good understanding of where the dollars are coming from. Detail the sources of funding, and if there's a shortfall that needs to be addressed before moving forward. And again, don't forget to include all those elements in the budget estimate, not just construction. Technology, medical equipment, FF&E. They can be a minimum of 30%, likely more, of your overall costs. Compare the budget to scope and ensure there is a balance. Again, the example I mentioned earlier, the particular project we were discussing that I mentioned about where it was only construction, happened to be a pretty large imaging project. And imaging equipment, if anyone knows anything about it, from our hospital folks on the line here, there's non-hospital folks, it is an enormous expense with some of these large, high-end pieces of imaging equipment. And so, excluding those pieces of imaging equipment weren't just like excluding some furnitures and fixtures. It was a huge, huge budget hit.
Curtis, I'm curious, selfishly, you had 30% for the, FF&E and technology was included in that.
At a minimum, sure.
Is that technologies like eBuilder to help get the project plan, design, and build, or was that more medical technologies?
No, more medical technologies. Medical technologies, the cabling, the IT infrastructure.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And then, at the end of the day, one of the things you have to look at, and it sounds kind of odd, here we are at the start of the project, why should I be thinking about transition and occupancy? Well, it's more than just the move. It's more than just facility readiness. It's understanding operational and functional readiness as well. So as you're going through those meetings to discuss how process flow drives design, drives your building, the owner needs to understand what it's going to take to truly implement those functional changes. And those things don't start several months before you move in. Those things typically start, those processes and those training sessions and those developing of process manuals typically start, a year, 2 years prior to building opening. So you're ready to get in. It's not just about the facility readiness. It's as much about functional readiness than anything. So start early. And we typically recommend that folks, that owners start thinking about transition and readiness in the design phase, soon after schematic design. To start thinking about, okay, now I've defined my design based on function. How am I truly going to operate this building? So let's wrap it up here with a few thoughts about lessons learned and some things you can do after today. You know, I haven't been involved in strategic and capital projects for the better part of a couple of decades. And being part of a firm that specializes in management and launching of projects, I can't emphasize the importance of diligently assessing all the aspects of your project to help you effectively manage those big three elements, the scope, schedule, and budget. Early on, leave no stone unturned. You'd rather uncover a misalignment early or ask the question you don't think of before you get into detailed design and construction. And as I said earlier, it's a lot easier, a lot less frustrating, and a lot less costly to change course or assumptions during the planning and launch phases than it is when you're moving dirt around or putting up structural steel. You know, there are going to be bumps in the road during your project journey, and it's best to get them smoothed out early when they're speed bumps than have to address them later when they're mountains. So what can you do today? Begin collecting and analyzing as much information as possible during that discovery phase. Talk with your colleagues and the leaders in the organization. Listen to them and ensure they're all on the same page, and if not, insist they get on the same page before you move forward. You know, if money's tight, prioritize. Remember, projects must enable the strategic direction of the hospital organization, generate a positive return on investment, or address that critical infrastructure item. Identify gaps in what you've done versus what needs to be done to get a project off the ground, and develop an implementation plan to bridge those gaps. Keep moving methodically and logically. You know, don't let your competition pass you by or run you over. Don't put the world on your shoulders too long. Don't be afraid to get help from experts, advisors, and champions, both internally and externally. You know, you shouldn't be putting all this on yourself. Listen to folks. Get help from the outside if you need it. Trust your subject matter experts. And lastly, yes?
We have a question here. How would you define the difference, they ask, between operational and functional readiness, and can you give an example?
Operational and functional readiness? Sure. Operational readiness, to me, is simply having the staff and the parts and parcels in place where they need to be. Functional element, how I determine functional readiness, is having that staff truly understand how a patient or how a particular element is going to move, a widget is going to move through the system. So I know that I need 3 nurses. Now those three nurses know how to get a patient through the system. That's the functional element of it.
Great, and a follow-up to that is just the clarification on the first bullet where you have collect as much information as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Is that financial information? Is it past design information? They're asking if you can be more specific on that, if anything sticks out more than another.
All of the above. Based on each, we utilize a tool, a data request tool, and have a simple checklist that we go through that addresses each element on that wheel, everything from strategic master facilities plan to what design has been discussed. Have you discussed the process? Have you discussed the financial budget? And we have this list, and we request that information, and we start checking off. This has either been collected or it hasn't been. And we also assess it as well. It's not just merely making sure that it's been done. It's making sure that it's been done correctly. So it's all those different elements that I mentioned earlier, those different spokes on the wheel. Make sure we collect it all. With that, I welcome any additional questions. My contact information is up on the screen. Feel free to contact me at a later date if you'd like to. And with that, I'll just open it up and say, I'll say thank you, John. Thank you, Sergio, for the opportunity, and open it up to any additional questions.
Okay. So good. So I've been kind of peppering you with some of the questions that we've had throughout. And what I'd like to ask is, I looked through the list. There's about 100 people that attended today, and I would say, more than half of them are owners, and a good amount of those are in healthcare. And so if I'm an owner listening to this, and you've talked about all these checklists, I'm thinking 2 things. Either, the person I have internal that's working with me, hopefully is asking these questions. If not, is essentially what you described, all these questions, effectively a checklist that you at KLMK have, and you shuttle these clients through the process, or do you teach them the questions to ask and then let them implement it on their own?
Both. We're firm believers of, again, another old adage, give a man a fish he eats for a day, teach him how to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime. And that's the way we feel as well. You got to give people the tools to be able to implement these things on their own. And if you have the staff and the ability to be able to do this, there should be no reason you shouldn't be left with a tool. And so we'll counsel our friends, our clients, on what needs to occur, the right questions to ask, and then leave them with that tool.
Okay. We have a question coming in here. What challenges have you encountered when compiling information or implementing the launch gap analysis that you should look out for?
Well, I think it's being able to get all the information in a timely manner. That's one. So some people are able to give you pieces of information very easily, and then a few months down the road you might get a piece. But people also think that just not having a piece of information is in and of itself a gap. That's okay if you don't have it. That's the gap. So there sometimes can be a little resistance. People think that they're being challenged or being picked upon, or they're being evaluated based on the information that's available. And that's not the case at all. Again, this is collaborative. This is in the best interest of everyone. The other thing, and early on we used to interview people in groups, and interviewing people in groups can sometimes get to groupthink. So early on in the process, try to interview as many people in leadership as you can individually, and then bring them together in a group process and say, here's what I've heard. You might not pin names to the comments, but here's what I've heard. Does this resonate? And people then will realize, yes, there's a gap here, or there's not. And when they see it like that from an individual's perspective, then folks are more receptive and more open to accept things as a gap.
Okay. There's another question that came in, but it's I'm going to read it here, and I'll see if we can make sense of it. It says, what percentage of a strategic project funds planning for a project prior to construction for success? So maybe what percentage of the strategic, maybe what level of funding goes up front? How much money maybe do you throw at the planning process prior to for success?
Sure. I think some of that is based on scope and scale. It is a small component, a small percentage of the project, I'll tell you that, but one that can pay off big time. And individuals sometimes don't want to take what they feel is a few $100,000 to put towards proper planning and to getting a few team members on early. They think that's money that boy, oh boy, do I really want to spend it? Well, you're going to spend it eventually. You have to have those members on, bring them on early, spend that early money up front, and that will eliminate the questions you get later, the scope changes that invariably cost more money down the road. And those change orders you get invariably, again, it'll cost money. So we believe that spending a little money up front, a small portion of the project, whether it be in internal time or external time, is the way to go. It'll definitely save you money down the road. Remember, it's a lot easier and a lot less costly to make changes during the planning phases. Once steel is up, it's much more costly.
Great. We have another question. They comment here that they agree with the process, and they try to do all these things for the projects that you've talked about. How do you educate people to make sure that you're getting the right people for this process? And they end by saying some people just don't have the thought process or the mindset around this type of process. So I guess, when you've been implementing it, how do you, when you see that the wrong people are there, do you tell the owner that? How do you try to educate these individuals? What do you do?
Sure. You got to be diligent about it, and people will begin to listen if you can show a few examples of low-hanging fruit where, hey, if we would have done it this way, or I've uncovered this needs to be done. Those simple things make people believers. We had a project once where folks weren't necessarily all bought into the process, and we got into looking at what they had done on the site relative to due diligence on the site. That was a thing that not a lot of people had a big understanding of what needed to be done, because they're clinical folks. And when we showed them, hey, here are the elements that are missing. This is the risk you are exposed to if you don't start addressing those now versus way down the road. If you wouldn't have uncovered this, this is where your exposure to the schedule could have and your expense could have been, then they were more receptive to opening up, their the books to looking at things like process and looking at other elements of the budget.
Okay, we'll take this last question here, and then if there aren't any others, Sergio, I'll turn it over to you next. The question here is, are there any return on investment studies that KLMK has done that shows when LGA is used, you get a certain type of return on investment versus when it's not used?
No, it's one of those things that you can place a value on only to say that we know that that you won't have the change orders. You won't have the changes early on that we think you can avoid. We think you can avoid a lot of those change orders down the road. It's hard to put a number on that. You've either done it with a launch gallop analysis or you haven't. I can tell you a project we're going into now, an experience we're having with an architect we're working with, and bringing them on early and helping with the integrated process planning aspect of launch gap, is having them involved early on in the process. They're bought into the program. They're bought into the flows. They don't have to have the additional meetings to get up to speed on the program. So when we recommended during the launch gap, we said, get your team on early, make sure we understand where the team is coming from, rather than just doing it in a traditional manner. They didn't see it initially. Now they're seeing it. They're saying, you know what, this is a value-added process. Because we've been through construction before. We've brought the design team on later, and you end up going through several meetings of rehash and changes. This will avoid all that. There won't be any changes coming out of the program after this process because the architect design team has bought into it.
And I agree with you about the reduction of change orders. I mean, it's no different than systems like eBuilder and others that tell the owner you're going to have that increased visibility into kind of an early radar warning detection system so that you could stomp out those issues. Curtis, a few people have asked if they can get a copy of your presentation. Is that something you're comfortable in doing?
Sure. John, Sergio, if you all, I guess we'll work through you all in getting that out, folks, or you can email me directly.
Okay, that's great. Those that are interested in getting a copy, just type into the chat, the letter P or Prezzo, and then we'll know that that's what you want. And then we did have one last question, so we'll take this last one and we'll give it to Sergio. They're asking, can you quantify how much time in the overall project schedule you can save with LGA? Let me know if it's a similar answer than before or if you've done specific.
Yeah, I think it's a similar answer. I think what it will do is it will certainly get you a better schedule and a tighter schedule. It's a process that doesn't need to take, some of these gaps you will identify and won't begin to implement and bridge for a while, things like transition. But some of these things, like the example I mentioned earlier about the site due diligence, that would have likely added 6-7 months, could have added 6-7 months onto the project had it not been uncovered early on that a lot of that work was not done to the degree it needed to be done. And we were able to bridge and hit that gap immediately. So it's a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Those of you that want others to hear it, Sergio is going to be making a copy of this and providing it online electronically in a recorded fashion. And Curtis, I think you've done a podcast with us as well for those that want to listen to it on their iPod, things of that nature. And on our corporate homepage of www.e-builder.net are all the previous webinars and podcasts. So until our next webinar, I'll turn it over to, I want to thank you very much, Curtis. I thought it was great. And I want to ask Sergio to end off with any of their final housekeeping items.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John. And again, thank you, Curtis. I think you did a great job. As John mentioned, wanted to remind everyone to please visit our website. There are tons of resources there. And as part of some of the information we're going to share along with the link to the recorded version of this presentation is a white paper we've been working on for the past month and a half. We should have that information ready hopefully in about a week and a half. Again, it's just going through this process of information gathering and conducting interviews to quantify or qualify some of the findings that we've had, where we'll share some new challenges to complement some of the information that Curtis shared today. So again, we'll be making that information available to everyone that registered and participated today. Again, John, thank you so much. Always, great job moderating. And Curtis, I hope you enjoyed your first webinar with eBuilder, and hope that you'll come back for more in the near future.
I'd be happy to. Thank you, and thank everyone on the phone for their time. I certainly appreciate the hour that you gave up in probably what is a very busy day for everyone. So thank you for the time, and thank you, Sergio.